Welcome to Destination History here on Destination Newry, and we're coming to you via the World Wide Web on the internet. So if you're in Carlingford or Canada, you're very, very welcome. And today we are joined by a man of the cloth, local man, priest, a member of the Dominican community, and a man who has served the community for some 43 years. I'm talking about Father Pat Tumilty. And Father, you're very welcome here to the history programme today.
Thank you.
I've just mentioned in the introduction that you're 43 years ordained a priest.
Yes.
And how has that time evolved?
Well, if I could go back a bit earlier to trace the origins of what I perceived as a vocation, I would say that, well, first of all, I had been going to the Dominican Church in Newry since I was 4 years of age. I used to go what was devotions every Sunday night, rosary, sermon and benediction, which the younger generation wouldn't have a clue about. But and at that time we lived on the Pond Road, which is just at the top of Monaghan Street, Monaghan Row, and you turn left there and you're into the Pond Road. And I used to come down the back way down the Pond Road and down Killen Street and to the Dominican Church on my own at the age of 4 every Sunday night. So I had a very early introduction to the Dominicans. And my memory, if it serves me correctly, and I think it does, it was when I was about 4 or 5 years of age, the then members of the community were Father Cleary, better known as Dr. Cleary, Dr. Pius Cleary, who was the prior, and he was a Dublin man. If word got out, as it invariably would, that Dr. Cleary was preaching on a Sunday night, the church would be absolutely packed with people because he was a brilliant preacher. And Cleary Crescent, just off Dominic Street, is named after him. Then there was a Father McCluskey. To me, he seemed to be a very, very old man. He had grey hair as I have now, and I have vague memories of him, but I don't think he lived for very long after I started going to the Dominican. Then there was Father Kirstein, and he seemed to be a relatively young man. And the name sounds strange, Kirstein. I believe he was a Cork man, but born of a German father. And he was one of the members of the community. And then there was the famous Father Murphy. And I'll talk a bit about him later on, because he played a great part in my deciding to become a Dominican. And then there was a Father Barry, not the Newry Father Barry, but a Cork man, Philip Barry. And when I joined the order, he seemed to be a relatively young man in his early 40s. He wore glasses, I remember that. And I believe he was a brilliant scholar. But when I joined the order, the Master of Novices, that is the man in charge of the first year Dominicans, told us that other Dominicans used to speak of him as being lazy, that he wasn't able to work too hard or didn't do too much. And they labelled him with this title. But then he had a premature death, and they found that the poor man had been labouring for a long, long time under a brain tumour. So the moral of the story is you can't judge. I remember the age of 5, up in our house in Pound Road, standing on a chair and preaching to an imaginary congregation at the age of 5. So I think there were inklings there even at that stage. When I was 12 and was entering the Abbey Grammar School, I distinctly remember making a resolution. And the resolution I made was that I would work very hard in my studies so that I would not fail any exams, so that I could become a priest. And I did work very hard. I studied every day, both in school and outside of school, and I never did fail an exam. And at the age of 13, I wrote to the then vocations director for the Dominican Order, and I said to him that I would like to become a Dominican. And I said, I want to become a Dominican because I want to be a preacher. And he wrote back to me and said, to want to be a preacher is a very good reason for wanting to be a Dominican. Because, as you know, the Dominicans put the letters OP after their name. And OP worldwide is in Latin, stands for two Latin words, Ordo Predicatorum, and translated into English, OP means Order of Preachers. So at the age of 13, I wrote to this man, this priest, in charge of vocations, and said that I wanted to become a preacher. And I remember another thing I used to do, used to play Mass. Used to pretend I was saying Mass. And I did that very often, and a friend of mine was always the server, and I was always the celebrant. And I remember one famous occasion which sticks in my memory. My friend's mother was a dressmaker, and one day I saw hanging over the banister of her stairs a Dominican hood, the hood that Dominicans wear. That's known as a capuce. And of course I wasn't slow to put it on, and we had a reading Mass that day. That capuce belonged actually to the prior at the time, Dr. Cleary, Father Cleary. And she was obviously repairing it for him. Two men who influenced me greatly towards the Dominicans were the late Father Stephen Murphy and the late Brother James Phillip. I approached Father Murphy at the age of 11 and a half and asked him could I become an altar boy. And he said he would think about it. I remember one Saturday going to confession to him. He heard in the same confession box that I myself now herein, and I was kneeling at Our Lady's altar saying my penance, and I got a tap on the shoulder, and it was Father Murphy. He said, do you still want to join the altar? And I said yes. And he said, come up at such a time and I'll talk to you. And I remember at this stage we were living in Drummalane, and I remember I raced like the hammers of hell, over to Tumilty to tell my mother that I was going to become an altar boy. But there was a bit of a downer involved in that as well, because at that time the altar boys wore what you call a soutane and surplice and a medal with the different liturgical colours. And my mother said, I can't afford to buy you a soutane. So I didn't know what to do, but I went back to Father Murphy anyhow, and he gave me an old soutane, a very old soutane, and I got my surplice. I was as happy as Larry, and I remember walking into the boys' vestry that first Sunday night, and I was putting on my soutane. And I remember one other altar boy said to me, that looks like the one I threw into the bin last week. Father Murphy was the first man I invited in, apart from the vocation director, that I wanted to become a Dominican. And we were standing under a bush up near Crenchico. It was raining heavily. And I was asking him all kinds of questions about the Dominicans, about St. Dominic, who greeted me quickly, and the work they do, and all the rest of it. And he said to me, I know what you're thinking. He said, I was thinking the same way when I was your age. So Father Murphy kind of directed me, took an interest in me, was very good to me. All during my time as an altar server, and in those days he used to take boys out for walks with them and to climb mountains, and I was one of those boys, so I felt very much under his influence. And remember when I was an adolescent, I used to go to confession to Father Murphy, and I found that he was a man who was ahead of his time in dealing with young people, especially in the delicate area of the confessional. So he kept on encouraging me, guiding me. I can never forget him. And then there was Brother James. Now, in my opinion, Brother James is a saint. In fact, it's more than just an opinion, I'm certain of it. Brother James was then quite elderly, and he did the work of 3 men. He was a brilliant gardener. He kept a beautiful garden up the back of Dominican. Dominican, you know, the site of the Dominican was an old quarry, you know, and that's why it's up all the way. But he had a beautiful garden with all kinds of vegetables and plants and flowers and rhubarb, and you mention it, he had it. And I used to help him in the garden, and I used to help him in the sacristy. I used to ring the angels for him every day, and every Saturday he used to give me a half-crown. And I remember one day being at the top of the Burnish with Father Murphy, and it was about 5:45, and I was thinking of the Angelus, but more importantly I was thinking of my half-crown. So I impressed Father Murphy very much. I took my leave of him at about 5:45 and ran like the hammers of hell down to Dominican and rang the Angelus, got my half-crown from Brother James, and went to Vinci Burke's shop in Dominic Street and bought my ice cream and sweets. But I was so eager to join the Dominicans that I decided at the age of 16 that I would enter as a brother. And I mentioned this to Brother James. And I remember what he said to me in his quiet voice. Pat, he said, don't. It's too hard. It was only years later that I understood what he meant by those words. Because truth to tell, at the time, brothers were treated like second-class citizens. For example, in more than one party, the priests would put out their shoes at night outside their door, and the poor brothers used to have to go around and polish those shoes. So, for brothers in those days, it was slave labour, and they really were treated as second-class citizens. And there was a separation between them and the priests. They couldn't eat at the same table as the priests, and they couldn't associate with the priests. They couldn't talk to the priests, and the priests couldn't talk to them. Of course, rules were broken, but that was the ruled land anyhow. But I always remember the advice Brother James gave me. So I didn't enter as a brother. I persevered with my studies, and in the Abbey, and eventually got my senior certificate, and left school on June 21st, 1963. Left the Abbey at the age of 18, and by a coincidence, that was the last exam I did was that day, last public exam. It was Latin, which I failed. I don't blame myself, I blame the teacher. But the joy bells were ringing in Newry Cathedral, and I knew immediately what that signified. It signified that a new pope had been elected. That pope was Paul VI, Montini. He was a pope who would be known in history for a famous encyclical letter which he published called Humanae Vitae, which means on human life, and that was the controversial encyclical on the ban on artificial birth control, which caused furore throughout the whole church. But he was elected the day I left school. So I left school on the 21st of June 1963. And I enjoyed my summer holidays, but I was preparing to join the Dominicans that September, and I remember there was a curate in Drummond called Father Hugh O'Neill, and he literally kitted me out with all the clothes and shoes and whatever I needed to join the order, because I don't think my mother could have afforded it. It would have been a great hardship on her to have had to buy those things.
What did your mother think, Father, of the fact that you were going to become a priest?
I think she was very happy. In those days, nowadays, many parents would be very angry if their son decided to become a priest, especially in the light of scandals in the church, especially in the light of the fact that we live in a post-Christian country. Where many Catholics no longer go to church, they'd be very angry. And I know one Italian priest, and when he joined the Dominicans, he was a late vocation. His mother cried the whole way during his reception of the habit. She was raging. But my mother was very happy, and so was my father. And so I left Newry about the 4th or 5th of September that year, 63. I remember being as proud as Punch in my black suit, my white shirt, my black tie, and my big hat. Thank God the hats are gone anyhow. And went down to Dublin Bridge Station, got the train there. With me were my parents and 3 of my siblings, and Martin and Sally. Martin and Sally are twins. I was talking to Martin there just about 10 minutes ago, 15 minutes ago, and they were going to secondary school that year. They were transferring from primary to secondary, so they were about 12 years of age then. I said my goodbye to them, and I got on the train and went across to Edward Street, and the friend with whom I used to play mass was going to Belfast that day. He and his mother, as she had a sister living in Belfast, and they came as far as Gora Wood with me. But we changed trains for Dublin. They went on to Belfast, but my friend, my good friend, God rest him, cried when I was leaving him. So I took the train to Dublin and then to Cork, and it took about 6 hours to get from Dublin to Cork in those days. Cork seemed very, very far away. You get to many parts of the world, some parts of the world nowadays, in a much shorter time. So I remember I made my way to the Dominican house in Cork, the novitiate house. I rang the doorbell, and Brother Hyacinth, a stout man, came out and welcomed me. So I went to the novitiate, and we were allowed the next day to go to a film, but that was the last film we saw for that year. Then we started a retreat, a 6-day retreat. It was given by a man called Father Joss O'Brien, who was later head of studies in our House of Studies in Tala. I studied under him and found him to be a marvellous teacher. But I was very, very homesick. And remember, homesickness is a real sickness. And I remember that night I wrote or tried to write a letter to my parents, and the tears were flowing down my cheeks. And for years I had a copy of that letter, and my mother kept it, and my tear blobs were on the page. But something Father Joss O'Brien said during the retreat, I don't know what it was, the whole homesickness lifted. So we started the novitiate, and that's really a spiritual year, and a year of learning about the Dominicans and Dominican traditions and Dominican constitutions and the rule of St. Augustine, which is the rule the Dominicans follow. And we had 3 or 4 classes a day under the auspices of our novice master, Father Brendan Dillon, who had that job for about 13 years. He was a hero to do so, but he did. And then at the end of the year's novitiate, it was time to move to the House of Studies. So we took for a while of to Cork for a while from Cork, and we went to Tala, which was then in County Dublin, which is now Dublin 24. And I suffered a bit of culture shock when I saw the size of Tala. It's a huge house. There were about maybe 130 rooms in it, plus kitchens and all the rest of it. And when I went there first, all of those rooms were full with priests and brothers and students. In Tala today now, there might be about 15 people in that big house, but there were about 125 to 130 when I joined. And so we did a retreat, and then we began our studies. Now, this was 1964, I was 19 years of age, and it was also the time of the Second Vatican Council. But the council hadn't really got into operation when I started my studies, and so we studied the traditional way. We studied through Latin, and for 3 years I did all my studies through Latin and all my exams through Latin. And the first 3 years were devoted to philosophy, which you say is a prelude to theology. The kind of philosophy we studied was scholastic philosophy or Thomistic philosophy. In other words, our main mentor was Thomas Aquinas, who is one of the greatest and most learned theologians and Dominicans that the church has ever produced. So we did other subjects as well, but then things began to change with the Vatican Council. The Mass was no longer in Latin. It was now in the vernacular. The office, that is the official prayer of the church, switched from Latin to the vernacular as well. And also things began to change in the House of Studies. We were granted a bit more freedom, and we were actually encouraged to go out and to do a bit of work, pastoral work, with lay people. Up until then, you followed a strict regime, beginning at 26 in the morning and ending at 10 at night. But you hadn't really much of any contact with people outside the community. And I got very involved in several projects as a student, my last 4 years. And in fact, I was out of the house so much that one day I got qualms of conscience, and I went into the Master of Students, and I said to him, "Father, do you think I'm out of the house too much?" And he just told me, "Continue as you're doing." So the changes were slowly but surely beginning. I would say if you were a student of the priesthood today now, it would be nothing in comparison as to when we were students. We lived under a very strict regime. A bell rang at 20 to 6 every morning, and you were meant to get up then and wash and dress and be in choir, that is church, for 6 o'clock in the morning, 6 o'clock. We had a half an hour of meditation, silent prayer. Then we prayed the divine office of the church. We chanted that. Then we had sung mass. And then I always remember we spent 7 minutes in thanksgiving after Holy Communion. But so we're up at 20 to 6, and I think we got our breakfast about 10 past or 8:15. We were on empty stomachs up to then. And we didn't break the silence, we kept silent. And we walked in 2 lines from the church to the dining room of the rectory, and complete silence. We had reading usually in Irish at breakfast in silence. After breakfast we went to the garden and said the rosary. Then we did our duties. Everybody had a certain duty to do, like keeping the place clean and all that type of thing. And then we had 4 classes, 4 50-minute classes in philosophy or theology, depending what you were doing. And with a break for 10 minutes for a cup of tea and 2 biscuits, 2 Marietta biscuits. And if you took 3 Marietta biscuits, you had to declare yourself in the chapter that you broke the constitutional fast.
Well, Pat, do you see the fellows that were along with you in the novitiate?
Yeah,
When you started,
yeah.
how many were there that year?
That first year, there were 19 of us.
And how many finished?
I think at the moment there are 5 of us.
No, but how many actually became priests out of the 19?
I'd say about 7.
7?
Yeah. And
12 fell by the wayside.
yes, some left as priests, and 1 man is dead. He was killed in a motorbike crash 2 years after ordination.
Oh, Lord.
Yeah. And he was the strongest man in the group, physically. Strong as a horse.
And now there's only 5 of those 19
Just 5 of us now, yeah.
left.
Yeah.
So when it came to the ordination, where was the ordination ceremony held?
The ordination ceremony was held in the Teacher Training College in Drumcondra in Dublin, the chapel there. It would usually have been held in Clonliffe College Chapel. Clonliffe was the house of studies for the Dublin diocese, and John Charles McQuaid always insisted it be held there. And while there you make a request to be ordained at home, because it wouldn't be granted, you know. But Clonliffe was getting some repair work done that year, and so we were sent to Drumcondra. And
was it John Charles McQuaid was the
he ordained us
ordained you?
in Latin.
Very good.
We were the second last group he ordained. He retired or 2 years after he ordained us, you know.
And of course he wielded a lot of influence in the Republic of Ireland at that time.
I'd say he was probably the man who wielded most influence. I'd say he wielded even more influence than the government. It used to be said that if the government were to bring in a bill or something that John Charles didn't agree with, John Charles just had a nod from Archbishop's house in Drumcondra, and the bill would be scrapped.
I would say you wouldn't be far off the mark. But
But
anyhow,
we took credit for it. Of course, the entire hierarchy did, you know, but him in particular. You know.
well, after you were ordained, then what became of you in your ministry?
Well, after I was ordained, I was sent to Rome, and I remember pleading not to be sent to Rome. I was sent for further studies, and I could have done them in Tala, And I asked the man in charge of studies, the region of studies. It was Father John Cahill, who spent a few years in Newry actually, and hated it. But he said, no, I think Rome would broaden your mind. So I went to Rome, and I remember two of us went overland. We got a certain amount of money for plane and that type of thing, and trains. We went overland. We went started off in Paris and went down through France and down through Italy, and then came to Rome after fortnight later. And I, as usual, never lost the old yearning for home. I was very homesick in Rome for several weeks, and I remember walking around the garden at night, crying my eyes out and cursing the day I ever took ordination. But got over that. I did my thesis. I had to finish by Christmas, and I could relax because the oral exams were not until maybe May or June. And I did a lot of weddings in Rome, Irish weddings, and I used to love doing them. Used to do them in a little chapel in the Vatican called St. Anne's. It's actually the parish church in the Vatican, and it meant a day out. It meant meeting people, but more important than that, it meant a few bob. And in that time we got very little money, and I was a smoker even in those days, you know. But what I used to do with the money, there was a restaurant in Rome called Scolio de Frisio. It was Irish American run, and myself and the late Father Gerard Fern of happy memory would go to that restaurant for a meal, maybe the next evening, on the proceedings of those takings. And we used to sneak out because we weren't allowed out, and without the prior's permission. And I remember one night we were all set to go, but the prior was standing yards away from us, and we didn't know what to do. We were in a bit of a quandary anyhow. So we had a quick discussion, and it was decided that I would go and ask the prior for permission to go out. And he said to me, the only reason you're asking me is because I'm standing here. But we went out anyhow. And it's amazing, before Gerard Fern died, weeks and weeks before he died, he wanted himself and myself to go to Rome for a weekend and to have a meal together in that restaurant. Got that notion into his head, you know.
That's a lovely story, Father.
So
He's sadly missed
yes,
Father Fern.
Yes, indeed. Father Fern was the man in charge of studies in Tallaght. It's called the Regional Studies, you know. And the region at that time was Father John Cahill, whom, as I already said, spent a few years in Newry.
Mm-hmm.
But it was during the Troubles, and he was of a nervous disposition and got caught up in one or two bombs, and it didn't exactly entice him to want to stay here. But he used to say that Gerard Fern was his white-haired boy, because John Cahill spotted Gerard Fern's intellectual abilities, and he pushed him. Gerard was had a great mind. I remember when we were in Rome studying together, he could chill out for most of the year, and at the last minute would go and study his Hebrew and Greek, go into an exam and do a brilliant exam. You know, Hebrew and Greek, as you know, are necessary languages for biblical studies, and he specialised in biblical studies. He was also a great teacher. He taught scripture for most of his life, and for 7 years of his life he taught scripture in India. He seminared in India with about perhaps 400 or 500 young students.
Well, he, like yourself, he was a very, very popular member of the Dominican community.
Yes, yeah.
And people in Newry respected him because he was very forthright.
Yes.
And as you know, like
Yeah,
he called it as he saw it.
Surely he did.
And people respected him.
Yeah.
And they felt, I think, they felt they had a benchmark with him.
Yes, yeah.
They knew exactly where they stood with Jared Fern.
Yes, yeah.
And he didn't condemn anyone. There was always room in the inn as far as he was concerned.
He said, as far as I'm concerned, a lot of very sound things with which the institution called the church might not agree, but he was certainly instrumental in changing my thinking on certain things. And
I think we would agree that he was very much in touch with grassroots.
he was indeed, yeah.
Like yourself, it has to
know
be
about
said.
that.
Has to be said that you have a good handle on grassroots thinking. You would be well tuned into modern thinking on church lines.
Well, I don't know about that, but certainly he was anyhow, and he kind of demythologized, that's a very big word, or debunked things that we were taught were simple. He influenced my thinking there, and I wouldn't quite agree with what I was taught in my youth, you know. And
Well, have things changed for the better, Father?
well, at the moment, I remember writing an article for a little magazine in 1985 down in Waterford, and this might sound very pessimistic, I don't know, but the title of the article was Post-Christian Ireland, ? And I remember one sentence I wrote in that article. I said, this was 85 now, perhaps in the not too distant future the church will have become part of the ancient history of this island. I wrote that in 85. After trying to read the signs of the times then, you know. I think there's a major crisis in Ireland at the moment. How that crisis is going to be resolved, I don't know, if ever. There are good things going on as well, but certainly a changed church, a church of my youth, and
Does it sadden you to see the way things have gone, Father?
well, certainly probably the crisis, the clerical sex abuse crisis, is probably as bad, if not worse, than that of the Reformation, you know. And I think there are certain people living in denial. They're carrying on as if nothing had happened. And I don't think that's a good thing. That's not good for the church. And
But on a pastoral level, how do you see things today regarding
well, I must say,
the place of the church, say, with the community today?
I think I feel that by and large the hierarchy has lost moral credibility. because of various happenings which we all know about. And the media is largely anti-Catholic. You can't trust the media. I think there are forces certainly working against a lot of good that the church has done and is doing. But I believe the church will survive, even if only barely. But I believe in Christ's promise that the church will be there to the end of time. But it is quite possible that the church could die out in a particular region or a particular country, but it won't die out worldwide.
Mm-hmm.
It might even get stronger. It is getting stronger in certain countries like Africa, and it's very strong in America. But it has happened before that Christian countries have become Muslim countries, you know.
And 43 years, Father Pat, in service with the order, and you're still carrying on, of course.
Doing a
And
bit.
you would do it all again, I'd say.
No regrets.
No regrets.
No regrets. No.
Well, that's a lovely way to be after a lifetime of work,
Yeah.
to be able to say that.
No regrets. As Edith Piaf said, you've heard of her, haven't you?
The famous singer, yes.
Je ne regrette rien. I regret nothing.
Very good. Very good. And of course, the other man of your genre would be Father Collins, another Newry man.
Collins, that's right, yeah, yeah. He'd be about 7 or 8 years ahead of me. You know.
Yeah, he's in Waterford at
He's in
present.
Waterford, yeah, yeah.
And was it just yourself, Father Fern, and in that particular era?
I was the last to be ordained from Newry and Dominican until about 3 years ago, when a lad called David Rocks was ordained.
Yeah.
But, between David and myself, David was only, is he 30? 33? I'm 68. There's that gap between a Dominican being ordained.
And how many students would there be training for the Dominican
At the
order?
moment, I believe we have about 20 young men in formation, you know.
Very good.
Yeah.
Something else that people would be interested, Father, before we finish, you know, it's a personal question in many ways, but what do you do for money to survive on?
The Newry people are very generous.
But do you get a salary, a wage?
We get a monthly allowance.
And the order looks after you regarding your clothing and
That's right, yeah.
one thing and another.
But I will say something that when I was being trained, we were told that the consecrated life, in other words, the religious life, was superior to married life.
Mm-hmm.
I would say, speaking from my experience, that my siblings who married have had much more difficult lives than I've had. I think marriage can be a very, very difficult vocation. And, well, you can't make comparisons. I'm just talking from my own experience. But I say my siblings have had much more difficult lives.
Yeah,
than I had.
more to cope with.
More to cope with and more demanding.
It's just come to memory too. Before we finish quickly, for both our sakes,
Yeah.
we forgot about we inadvertently forgot to mention Father John O'Rourke,
Yes, that's
former
right.
prior
Yes,
in St
Yeah,
Catherine's,
yeah.
and Father O'Rourke's in Tralee, isn't it?
Tralee, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So there would have been Father Collins, Father Fern, Father O'Rourke, and yourself.
Yeah.
4 of you in that generation.
That our era, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
And 3 of you are still, unfortunately, George no longer with us, as we said.
Yeah. And we're getting on.
Well, there's, as they say, there's life in the old dog yet, Father.
Yeah, please God.
But you're a familiar sight about the town and a popular man.
So we're always hanging around the town.
And hopefully you'll be with us for some time
I'm what
yet.
you call a corner boy. Corner boy.
Well, there'd be no. I take it that you would like to finish your ministry in Newry.
Please God. Please God.
There'd be no plans to
well,
move here.
At this stage of my life, I would hope not.
Very good.
You know.
Well, we look forward, Father Tumilty, to having you for a long time to come. And
very
thanks
much.
very much for joining us today.
Okay.
And we've enjoyed the chat.
Good.
Father Pat Tumilty, thank you very much.
Thank you.